close to the end of our session, and there's work to be done, comrades. Let us not waste precious time. Can we proceed with group one's?
So our conversation went beyond the scope of the questions that we were given, but I think the questions also really helped provide a guide in terms of the thinking and the way in which we approach these questions. And the first point and the thing that kind of grounded the conversation was understanding the history of what's called again different internationals or like deaf internationalism, and understanding what that history was, what caused the splits, what caused people to come together at that time, and what lessons can be learned from those experiences if we have to think about our current context now. And drawing from that or building on that is also understanding the experiences or the learning from the experiences of previous models and being aware of the effects of the lived experience of people who had lived within and across those societies, from social democracies, states such as the Soviet Union. You know, people are alive in today who have an understanding or may have a different view that can contrast or add to our perspectives on those things. And on this point, to break away from model thinking, that we need a new thinking. And that there's also an immediate task of rebuilding labor movements internationally. So understanding that, you know, transnational capital exists, so you will need a transnational labor movement and to build those kind of links. And we also need a new global vision, so that means that we need to start thinking beyond the scope of our own national interests, and that could be another foundation of what helps build a new international perspective. And one of the major themes that we also spoke about, and everyone, different speakers spoke in different levels with regards to this, was the idea or the concept of building convergences around, you know, initiatives that are already existing right now, the different movements and people who are already doing work on the ground at this time. So there's different, what's called again, there were different points made with regards to mass movements versus political power, for example, the distinction between people who may have a focus on building movements and then those who have a focus on building political power, how the two come together and the way in which they interact and the way in which they could help a new program that moves forward. Also, the need to differentiate between ideological and political disputes is also a very important point. That, you know, you need to understand the differences between an ideological dispute versus a political dispute, and that a new international would have to, or the process of creating a new international would have to work through consolidating and strengthening its ideological base, which once that body or organization would be formed, would have a foundation in which people come to. That wouldn't be something that stops the process or, you know, makes the political work that needs to come next difficult to achieve, because you have coherence. So that's something to think about, distinguishing between those kind of differences. And then also have the problem and the question of dealing with ego, and, you know, moving beyond cult of personality, and also grappling with the ways in which those can really bring harm to actual programs and initiatives that have supports, that have backing, and that are sorely needed. That's a real question that needs to be thought of. You know, that those are things that come along, they cause speed bumps. And de-academizing of the left debates, you know, and, you know, looking for examples of practical expressions of, you know, left programs as they exist in the real world, which could help create a basis to snowball towards, you know, a bigger program like a new international. You know, finding ways to make these kind of discussions and these kind of questions more easily accessible to the person outside. I think when we spoke about this, I think you might have said something, you don't like saying normal person, or someone said that they don't like saying like normal people. But like, I think a better way of saying someone who's outside from the space, but also has the same kind of like value. So finding ways to make these questions, these debates more accessible to people to engage in who would or could add value to such a program. And then another big question was also to ask, going back on the point that was made during the presentation, is that why has an international not been formed? You know, and that's having to really grapple with that question of that if something was created, would people buy into it and why would they not buy into it? You know, what are the things that would stop people from engaging that? Like, how do you ensure that it'll be attractive to people's parties and movements and organizations around the world that exist today? And then also a crucial grounding of this new process, something which came up many times during the conversation, is the universalizing of ideas and principles. And one which I think gained a lot of consensus throughout the group was the idea, or the universalizing of the idea of defending life. That is something which a number of other principles would spring out of, and it's something that could act as a core in terms of thinking around other concepts and values that this process would be guided by. Because it's also important to take into note that the context in which we're speaking in is one where the left has suffered many defeats and it's at a weak point, but you need something for people to look towards that, you know, brings people still together in light of our current context. And I think another important point to note here that was made is that socialist movements were destroyed by being co-opted into neoliberalism. Then we also have to think around, you know, issues of top-down versus bottom-up approaches, and that there needs to be some kind of convergence between the two. And that there might not necessarily be one direct path that needs to be taken, but finding a kind of symbiotic relationship and fluidity between the way in which those kind of, you know, approaches to organizational functioning occur. I'm working on time. Okay. Okay. And then, okay, I think another important point that I think I'd like to, 2 points that I actually want to end on then is making the feminization of politics understood and attractive, which will help people move away from, you know, dogma of the past, which may limit the relevance of current struggle, which also helps expand the space to new people, and also would keep us on path of like what's relevant, you know, keep us on focus of what needs to be done in the now. And I think another final point is how do we democratize knowledge production? And I think you said it comes down to the practice of the collective intellectual. Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks, Hilda. Then I'll ask from group 1 in less than half a minute. Any additions? None? Okay, thanks. We can move on to group 2. So you have an extra half a minute to report. Thanks.
I'm the only one that took notes, so I guess it's me. So I was the youngest person in the group and also the only non-South African, so you'll have to excoriate my incomplete synthesis. So we started off talking about the other internationals which weren't discussed in this forum, from Via Campesina to the International People's Health AIDS International, the idea of a feminist international drawing out of the women's marches, African Ecofeminist Network, Water Warriors. These are a few different groups of international organizations. And the idea that was put forward that we should really have a clear census of who's doing what. Thinking of a joke to punctuate that, but again. So we just putting the idea there, the warning that we may not be learning enough from what already exists in the process of doing this. Another point was raised about how most of the internationals that exist are really more defensive in nature. sort of doing damage control or reacting to the attacks, and the need to sort of to do that, but to have a vision of the future as well. Also, of course, the youth movement was brought up. Various people mentioned that there wasn't quite enough attention to that. Also, the International of Occupy / Indignados / the Beirut, how these movements kind of, but the question is coalescence. How do they come together when there's not really a common ideology or organization? So there's this sense that there's all these internationals out there, and there's a quarter of the world is in revolt, according to Patrick. But are we really connected to those masses? Are the internationals sort of having their separate meetings, and a quarter of the world is? How do we bridge that to have unity of concrete struggles? Then sort of throughout there was a lot of discussion of South African history and its relation, things we can learn from that for internationalism. The discussion of UDF strategy versus non-strategy, there was some disagreement. The idea of, the history of connecting boycotts to Free Mandela and how that could be a model for an international organizing where we have a concrete struggle but we connect it to a bigger thing. Reiterated the necessity to understand the conditions that people are living in before we just start coming and talking to them. There was also discussion, mostly what these are questions, folks. Mahmoud said it's a lot of work to come up with the right questions. Maybe the right questions are more important than the right answers, so that's the context for my presentation here. The question of personalities, the First International said, we deal with principles, not personalities, but do we need them? But we do need them sometimes to bring people together. This was sort of an ongoing question. We have these personalities, these charismatic personalities, but they're only relevant when there are movements that come behind them. They emerge from movements, sometimes they also convoke movements. So this question of the need to be wary of too much weight on personalities, but sort of the fatalism, I guess, that they'll be involved in some way. There was talk about the need of sparking the imagination of the young who don't really care about left history, or may not know about left history. Fifth International, I've encountered this, whether it's Fifth International, because what's an international? People are more maybe engaged in concrete, immediate defensive struggles. Talking about youth particularly, not just the youth in the suburbs, which are getting attention in the international press, but youth in the townships who have no hope of income. How are these internationals going to relate to those conditions? We discussed eco-socialism as a concept, as a comprehensive concept, as opposed to sort of a subset. I don't want to put too much of my own ideas into this as try to represent the group. There's the question about what's the relation of organized labor. That used to be the core of the left, and now it's sort of nowhere to be seen in a lot of these discussions. So that's sort of another open question. Talked about the need for examples of hope. Then there was some discussion about, this particular moment that we're in relation to the coronavirus. This is really the moment for concrete, urgent international action, demands, campaign. Somebody mentioned earlier this might be the last forum we're going to be in for a while. So this is kind of an urgent thing to think about. There's some initiative that was mentioned put out of the U.S. I haven't seen about grassroots document of demands. This is, as was said, this is the next world universal experience. Even though people are suffering from maybe far worse issues, the whole world right now is sort of shuttered at home. And is this a moment that we can really push a left internationalism in some kind of concrete way? This discussion about the concept and the practice of convergences. What is our convergence point to bring groups together? The need to do this around concrete issues. A quick discussion about the methodology of the RDP, Reconstruction Development Process, and how that here, I don't know that history here, but I'm sure many of you do very well. And the possibility of doing something like that with the climate justice activists, where you have a participatory sort of grassroots consultation that leads up to something. And I guess the last point that for I don't know, anybody else can please weigh in about what I'm missing here, but is in terms of the question of convergence between the three initiatives that were presented here, there's definitely, it begins with dialogue, like we are doing here. And everybody, was very supportive and happy of the idea that these initiatives should all be in conversation with each other. There are organizational details about whether one can join the other, but we can't have that conversation until we have the dialogue. But then it was clarified, I think, very strongly, I resonate with it, that about the context for that dialogue. The context for that dialogue has to be mass struggle of where people are, the real conditions that people are in, as opposed to sort of a separate forum somewhere. So I don't know, if anybody in the group could feel free to add. There was a very rich discussion, a lot of which was detailed history of South Africa, which I wasn't familiar with, so sorry if I've left anything out. Yeah.
Just to amplify the one point you mentioned, youth.
Yeah.
And, one youth phenomenon that's gripped the world, the imagination of the world, is the Greta movement. And it's two people, right on the point from here, the manner in which social media was able to generate this international. It's an international around climate change, inspired by a young girl. I think I need to record that.
One.
I'm going to sit down, but go ahead.
Just one of the small points is I think which I didn't hear you say, is that you talked about local organizations and working together with state structures where it's possible. In some cases it's possible to get some kind of resources from the state. It might be a local municipality, it might be a hospital, it might be a school, it might be a clinic, with the local organizations. But that's a tricky one, we said, in South Africa because of the corruption. So we have to be very careful how we handle something like that we don't want to give any state structure any kind of credibility in that process.
I would imagine there's a string of caveats we need to add to that. So the key part of that is not without abdicating agency.
Yes, without abdicating, to retain control of the process.
Okay. Thanks, comrades. I think what we could do now is a call on our host, the convener, to maybe engage with us as to what happens next. But I think also before we ask Vish, and I don't want to just assume I'm speaking on everybody, but find it very doubtful if I'm not. I think there's also opportunity to thank COPAC, to thank Vish, and comrades, Courtney and the rest, everyone else who assisted in bringing together convening, and also being fortuitous, getting ahead of the curve of coronavirus so that we actually could have an international gathering.